Hey everyone, it's Pumpkin, and I'm back with another Creepypasta reading and Speedpaint video. Today's pasta is special as I've taken the classic Creepypasta Squidward's Suicide and rewritten it myself to improve the writing quality and pacing of the story. I hope you guys like it. A lot of things in this world are unexplainable. No answer to be found, no logical conclusion to come to. Just the frightening prospect of the unknown, the mystery of the dark depths, and the depraved creatures lurking within. Once, decades ago, I used to work for Nickelodeon, more specifically the team working on the American side of SpongeBob's production, such as storyboarding and writing. Now, I wasn't very high on the production team's totem pole per se. I was just a production assistant, but I had hopes and dreams of one day possibly being a storyboard artist down the line, or maybe even having a spot in the writer's room. Of course, this was all before the incident that made me leave my job at Nickelodeon forever. Part of my job involved setting up meetings for the crew, bringing them lunch and coffee, and managing production assets for the team, so often I would be there to witness rough cuts of episodes long before they would hit the air, oftentimes in different forms than the end products would end up taking. There was always just a bit of magic watching the episodes come together from rough animatic to rough animation to the almost finished product, and then comparing to the episode that actually ends up airing. The day of the incident, I'd finished setting up a meeting for the writers, animators, and editors to look over this batch of rough cuts, so the team could go over what did and didn't work in said cut and what fixes were necessary on a script level or a visual level in the animation. The other production assistant for this story, I'll call him Kevin, was logging on to the computer and pulling up the Office network so he could retrieve the files for the episode cuts we'd be looking at today. I stood to the side, setting up the connection between the room's television monitor and the computer as the other members of the production crew all shuffled into the boardroom, taking seats with their coffees and notepads. Once I was sure the wired connection was good, I let Kevin know, and he already had the folder with the rough cuts open. Everything was going well, and we watched the first couple rough cuts, which I believe ended up becoming Fear of a Krabby Patty and Shell of a Man respectively, and they seemed pretty good so far. But then Kevin put on the next cut, and that's when things got strange. Now, the previous two episodes didn't have proper title cards yet, as usually in this stage of production, a rough cut would only contain the raw animation, no titles or transitions. Not always. There's a rare couple that did have filler titles, such as Plankton's Army had the filler title Plankton's Last Stand in its rough cut, but a lot of the time they don't, since a final title may not have been chosen for the episode, or no art had been made for the title card yet. This episode started with a title card that read simply, Red Mist. Now, not every SpongeBob episode title is necessarily descriptive of the episode's contents, but I struggled to imagine what kind of episode would justify a title such as Red Mist. Perhaps an episode relating to Red Tide? That was the only ocean-related thing that particularly came to mind when I thought Red Mist. After the title, it cut to Squidward playing his clarinet, sounding much more shrill than usual, resembling a shrieking cat more than a woodwind instrument, but he seemed prideful in his skills nonetheless. That is, until something led him to stop his playing, and with one last extremely off-key note, a knock was at his door, causing Squidward to sigh in his usual fashion and walk to the door. His walking sound effect seemed a lot louder than was typical of the show. I chalked that up to this being a rough cut, however. Of course, the editing wouldn't be perfect, as it was minimal in these animation clips. He opened the door, and there was a fish in a kilt and Tammy outside the door, with a concerned look to his face. Squidward, thinking this was yet another dying cat bit, like in Band Geeks, was just about to slam the door in this man's face, but he pushed his hands into the door before Squidward could shut it. "Sir, please take your hands off my door," Squidward said with an annoyed sigh, but his voice felt off somehow. More like someone doing an impression of Roger Bumpus, and not actually him. Perhaps Roger just hadn't been in to record his lines yet, and this was just temporary scratch audio for the purpose of this cut, and would be replaced later in the production. "It is coming," was all the man said, before pulling Squidward's door shut himself. Squidward, chalking this up to the world just trying to get on his nerves again, went back up the stairs to practice his clarinet some more. He got a few notes out before SpongeBob's signature laugh interrupted, and Squidward looked furious. I could have swore I saw his eyes flash red for a moment, perhaps just an animation error. I'd seen plenty of my time working here, viewing rough cuts, but something just felt strange about the look of his eyes for that brief frame. He turned to his window and opened it. "Would you two imbeciles keep it down for 1 hour?" Squidward yelled out of his window, waving his hand, the one holding his clarinet, out of the window. "Unlike you two morons, I'm actually successful at life, and I have a concert tonight, so keep it down, will you?" "We're sorry, Squidward. We'll try to be more quiet," SpongeBob said, and this barely sounded like Tom Kenny doing his voice. Yeah, we're sorry, Squidward," Patrick added on, but that did not sound like Bill Fagerback at all. Maybe all of the cast members were just busy when this cut was being put together, so once again I tried to think of nothing of it. Squidward closed his window and commenced his practicing of his concert set once again. The episode jump cut to the end of Squidward's concert. We're using the same audio as his practice earlier in the episode, but the frames were choppier than was typical of a rough episode cut. I looked at Kevin, but he shrugged, as there seemed to be nothing wrong with the file or the program the video was being played on, so I just looked back at the screen again and continued to watch. The animation smoothed itself out, and Squidward moved into a resting position and froze there. There was silence in the episode, and I swear one of the animators coughed for a moment, Squidward just staring directly into the camera. I looked at Kevin again, and he shook his head. He hadn't paused it, but while I had been looking away, the sound of the in-show audience began booing, and I immediately looked straight back into the television. The audience wasn't moving, but they were booing louder and louder and louder, as if the volume was being raised, and I looked over to Kevin again, but his hands weren't even on the keyboard or mouse. In fact, he wasn't even looking at the computer. He was looking at the television like everyone else had been, so he clearly hadn't messed with the volume. Eventually, the booing crescendoed into more of a loud, warped roar than a crowd yelling, and I and many of the other crew ended up having to cover our ears while Kevin frantically turned back to the computer and adjusted the volume of the clip, as to not blow all of our eardrums out. When it was safe to uncover my ears, they rang faintly, but I continued to watch the episode. It cut to a close-up of Squidward's face, his eyes rendered in an uncomfortably realistic way. I could almost see the tears welling up in them, glossing them over, making my own eyes water. Every last detail of his eyes, the pupils, the irises, even the capillaries and blood vessels of the sclera looked more like a high-resolution photograph of a man's eyes than something that could have been drawn, and this was eerie to witness. Was this supposed to be some sort of joke? Because it was coming off a lot more disturbing than funny. It cut back to the audience, and they all had the same extremely rendered eyes as the sound of television static began to fade in. I glanced for a moment at some of the writers for the show in confusion, but they all looked just as confused as I did, so whoever was behind this was not in this room, as far as I was aware at least. The energy of the room also became a lot more tense and a lot more uncomfortable. I looked back to the episode, and it had cut to Squidward on his bed that night, sobbing into his tentacle hands. The odd thing was, this felt more like a genuine cry of pain than cartoon-like crying Squidward had done in previous episodes. His sobs were almost painful for anyone with any sort of empathy to hear. The scene of him crying lasted very, very uncomfortably long, and I started to question this episode. Was this some sort of prank? I doubt children would want to watch a character they're attached to be in this much pain and sorrow. Then it happened. It cut directly in front of Squidward with his hands over his eyes as he lowered them to reveal his overly rendered, bloodshot eyes once again. They felt even more uncomfortable and unnerving than the first shot of them that had been shown to us. They also looked a lot more bloodshot than previous and tinted slightly red. The recognition washed over me. That must have been that one odd frame from earlier into the episode. He stared into all of our souls, and loud static washed over the room, enough that a lot of us clapped our hands over our ears again in discomfort, and this was with the volume turned down. Kevin tried to turn the volume down, but even the lowest setting was painful to our ears until the sound stopped entirely. During the static, it must have zoomed in on Squidward's face because the screen was now just his overly realistic rendered eyes, tinted red and staring. Unsettling whispers came on, and several images flashed over the screen too quick for any of us to tell what was on screen, and it cut back to a full view of Squidward, and a deep voice rasping out, "Do it." Squidward suddenly had a gun in his hand, and I was just barely able to cover my eyes with my hands just as I heard the gunshot in the video, and I heard the other members of the crew in the room, the poor souls who hadn't looked away, gasp and yell out in horror and shock. I peeked through my fingers and saw highly rendered blood and brain matter strewn about Squidward's bed and the rest of his room, as well as his now partially collapsed head, rendered as if referenced from an actual photo of a suicide. My guts churned and I ran for the trash can in the room and released my lunch. Kevin immediately went to the room's phone and called for Paul, the supervising producer, and Steven, the show's creator, now production consultant after the movie had come out, to come in and see this, and also took a turn at the trash can when I was done puking my own brains out. Both showed up within minutes, and the rest of the crew speedily filled out. I don't blame them, and unfortunately, me and Kevin were forced to relive the horror as we showed Paul and Stephen this monstrosity of an episode cut. Worse yet, during the final scene, Stephen asked Kevin to go over brief frames that flashed on the screen, and that was when the true horrors were revealed. Several crime scene photographs of mutilated dead children filled the screen, and each frame Kevin clicked onto was worse than the last. I returned to the trash can again, but this time it was just dry heaving. Paul just sat there, staring deadly at the screen, shaking his head and occasionally resting his forehead to his palm, completely horrified by what he was seeing. After the episode finished, Stephen took a look at the computer to see if there was anything to note about how this episode ended up in the batch when he found the timestamp on the file. It was minutes before we began watching, clearly added on from someone else connected to the studio's network, when we were watching one of the episode cuts. We can't let this get out to the public. I'm going to talk to Mr. Scannell, Stephen said, burning off a DVD of the offending episode and then leaving the room. Following that day was weeks of investigation into the crew members, Kevin and me, as well as the security of the studio's computer networks, and the possible origins of the photos that were in the episode. Unfortunately, no solid leads ever came from any of this, and the investigation was shelved eventually. I only stayed in that job for a month afterwards. I just couldn't bear to enter that boardroom again without thinking about what I saw and how it had affected me. I put in a resignation letter and ended up going to a trade school to get into a new career far away from animation and far away from Burbank. But even all of these years later, that episode and those photos still haunt me. The most terrifying part was that you could see the shadows of the photographer in the images, and they matched Kevin's silhouette. And that was my rewrite of Squidward's suicide. I hope you like the story and the art. A special thanks to my patrons and my followers on the various social medias I am on. The Reddit post of the art will be linked in the description down below, along with my Patreon and social media. I'll be back with another pasta video where I'll be reading The Expressionless by Ivy Sir.